The wheelchair wasn't supposed to be permanent. That's what they told me in the rehab center, what the doctors whispered when they thought I wasn't listening, what my family repeated like a prayer they didn't really believe in. But 3 months after Uncle Marcus backed his truck over my legs in what everyone called an unfortunate accident, I was still staring at a ceiling that had become my sky, learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt too tall for me to reach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory plays on repeat sometimes. The sound of gravel crunching under tires, the way the summer heat shimmered off the asphalt of my grandmother's driveway, the taste of lemonade still sweet on my tongue from lunch. I was 22, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and dreams bigger than the small town that raised me. I'd been lying on a blanket behind his truck, reading a book, completely invisible from his driver's seat. Or so I thought. The weight of 3,000 pounds crushing bone doesn't make the sound you'd expect. It's quieter than breaking glass, softer than thunder. Just a dull crack, like stepping on dry branches, followed by a silence so complete it felt like the world had paused to witness what couldn't be undone. Then came the screaming. Mine first, raw and animal-like. Then Uncle Marcus, shouting words I couldn't process through the white-hot explosion in my spine. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I need you to understand something about my family before I tell you what they did to me in that hospital room while I was learning to live in a body that no longer obeyed my commands. We weren't rich, but we were tight-knit, the kind of Hispanic family where Sunday dinners were mandatory and everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Uncle Marcus was the success story, the one who'd made it out of construction work and into his own landscaping business. He had the biggest house, the newest truck, and a reputation for taking care of his own. He also had a drinking problem that everyone pretended not to see. The first 3 weeks after the accident were a blur of surgeries and specialists, of learning medical terms I never wanted to know, and facing truths I wasn't ready to accept. Complete spinal cord injury at L1. Paraplegia. Permanent. The words hit like separate punches, each one landing before I could recover from the last. My parents took shifts at my bedside, my mother clutching rosary beads and my father making phone calls to insurance companies with the desperate efficiency of a man trying to hold his family together with paperwork and prayer. Uncle Marcus visited once during those first weeks. He stood at the foot of my bed, his usually confident presence diminished to something small and shaking. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he smelled like aftershave covering something sharper underneath. He kept saying he was sorry, that he never saw me, that it was just a terrible accident. His voice cracked on the word accident, like it was too heavy for his mouth to carry. I believed him then, because what choice did I have? The alternative was too ugly to consider. It was my cousin Sophia who first mentioned the lawsuit. She was Uncle Marcus's daughter, a law student at the state university who'd driven down the moment she heard. She sat beside my bed one afternoon while my parents were in the cafeteria, her laptop balanced on her knees and her dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Elena," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about your situation. Dad has business insurance, liability coverage. This could help with your medical bills, your future care needs. You're going to need modifications to your living space, specialized equipment, ongoing therapy. The costs are going to be enormous." I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little holes in each square, because it was easier than thinking about the word lawsuit applied to my own family. Sophia kept talking, explaining concepts like negligence and liability in the gentle way she probably used with clients. But all I could think about was Uncle Marcus's face when he'd stood at my bedside, broken and sorry and drowning in guilt. "I don't know," I whispered. "It feels wrong, like I'd be punishing him for an accident." Sophia's fingers paused on her keyboard. "Elena," she said, her voice carrying a weight I didn't understand yet, "accidents happen. But we need to make sure you're protected, that's all I'm saying." Before I could ask her what she meant by that, my parents returned with coffee and forced smiles, and Sophia closed her laptop with a decisive click. The conversation ended, but something had shifted in the room, a tension that felt like the moment before lightning strikes. That night, lying in the mechanical bed that had become my world, I called my best friend Maya. She'd been my roommate in college, the sister I chose rather than the one I inherited, and she'd been calling every day since the accident with updates from the outside world that felt increasingly foreign to me. But that night, I needed to hear a voice that wasn't careful, that wasn't measured and gentle and afraid of saying the wrong thing. Maya answered on the first ring, and I could hear music in the background, the sound of normal life continuing without me. "Elena," she said, and her voice carried relief and worry in equal measure. "How are you holding up?" I told her about Sophia's visit, about the suggestion of a lawsuit, about the way the word felt like swallowing glass. Maya listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was different, smaller. "Elena, can I ask you something? And you have to promise to hear me out before you get angry." I promised, though something in her tone made my stomach clench. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," she said, "about the whole thing, and some stuff isn't adding up for me. You said Uncle Marcus couldn't see you behind the truck, right? But Elena, you were lying on a bright yellow blanket, in July, in direct sunlight, and that truck has backup sensors. I looked up the model online." My throat felt tight. "Maya, don't. Just listen," she continued, and now her voice carried the determination I recognized from our late-night study sessions when she'd refused to give up on a problem until she'd solved it. "I drove past your grandmother's house last week when I was visiting my mom. That driveway isn't big, Elena. It's narrow, and there's nowhere to back up without seeing what's behind you. The angles don't work for this to be a complete accident." The words hit me like ice water. I'd been so focused on learning to live with what happened that I hadn't questioned how it happened.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The details Maya mentioned felt both obvious and impossible, like puzzle pieces that had been sitting in front of me the entire time, but in a picture I'd refused to see clearly. "What are you saying?" I whispered. "I'm saying maybe Sophia was right about the lawsuit," Maya said gently, "but maybe for different reasons than she told you." After we hung up, I lay in the dark for hours, replaying every detail I could remember from that day. The way Uncle Marcus had been at lunch, quieter than usual, his hand shaking slightly when he reached for his water glass, the smell of beer on his breath when he hugged me goodbye, which I'd dismissed because it was a Sunday and he was always more relaxed on Sundays, the way he'd backed up so quickly, without the careful precision I'd seen him use hundreds of times before in that same driveway. The backup sensors, Maya mentioned. I remembered them beeping in his truck before, short chirps that warned when something was too close. Why hadn't they worked that day? Or had they worked exactly as designed, warning of an obstacle he chose to ignore? Sleep didn't come that night, and when the morning shift nurse arrived with my medication, I asked her a question that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Is there a way to get a copy of the police report from my accident?" She paused in arranging my pills, her kind face creasing with concern. "Honey, why would you need that? Everything's already been handled through insurance, hasn't it?" "I just want to see it," I said, "to understand what happened." She nodded slowly, the way medical professionals do when they're trying not to alarm you while making mental notes to mention your request to the doctors. "I'll ask the social worker about it," she said. "She handles those kinds of requests." 2 days later, Sarah Martinez, the hospital social worker, arrived with a manila envelope and an expression I couldn't read. She was young, probably only a few years older than me, with the kind of professional competence that made her seem both sympathetic and untouchable. "Elena," she said, settling into the visitor's chair with the envelope in her lap, "I was able to get a copy of the police report from your accident. Before I give this to you, I want to make sure you're prepared. Sometimes these reports contain details that can be difficult to process, especially when you're still recovering." I held out my hand, surprised by how steady it was. "I need to see it." She hesitated for another moment, then handed over the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have, like it contained more than just paper and ink. I waited until she left before opening it, my hands trembling now that I was alone with whatever truth lay inside. The report was typed on official letterhead, filled with the kind of clinical language that turned human tragedy into bureaucratic details. But buried in the measured prose were facts that made my blood run cold. Officer James Henderson had interviewed multiple witnesses. Mrs. Patterson from next door had seen Uncle Marcus drinking beer in his truck for approximately 20 minutes before the incident. The responding EMT noted a strong odor of alcohol on the driver. Most damaging of all, the truck's backup warning system had been functioning normally when tested after the accident. But there was more. A note at the bottom of the report, added 3 days later, stated that the family had requested no charges be filed and that the driver was cooperating fully with the investigation. The case was marked closed with no further action recommended. I read that last part 3 times, each reading making the words feel more impossible. The family had requested no charges be filed. Not Uncle Marcus. The family. My family. They'd made a decision about my life, about justice, about truth, without asking me. While I was unconscious and fighting for my future, they'd chosen to protect the man who'd destroyed it. The envelope slipped from my numb fingers and scattered pages across my lap, but I barely noticed. Everything I thought I understood about my accident, about my family's support, about Uncle Marcus's grief-stricken visits, crumbled like sand in my hands. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a drunk driving incident that my own family had covered up. I thought about every visitor who'd sat beside my bed with sad eyes and gentle words, every conversation about God's plan and silver linings, and how accidents happen to test our faith. I thought about Uncle Marcus's red eyes that day, how I'd interpreted them as tears of remorse, when they might have been the bloodshot gaze of someone still working alcohol out of his system. I thought about my parents' careful conversations with insurance companies, their focus on coverage and care plans, never once mentioning the possibility that someone should be held accountable for what happened to me. They knew, all of them knew, and they'd decided that protecting Uncle Marcus was more important than protecting me. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "On our way up with dinner from that Mexican place you like, Dad found out they delivered to the hospital." I stared at the message, at the casual affection and normalcy of it, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. They were coming to feed me and smile at me and ask about my physical therapy progress, and the entire time, they'd be carrying a secret that was bigger than my paralysis, more damaging than my injuries. When they arrived an hour later, my father carrying takeout bags and my mother clutching a bouquet of daisies from the hospital gift shop, I watched them with new eyes. My dad's smile seemed forced now, and my mother's chatter about the weather and her garden felt desperate, like she was trying to fill the air with anything that wasn't the truth. "How was your day, mija?" she asked, settling the flowers in a vase with practiced efficiency. "Did the physical therapist say anything encouraging?" I held the police report in my lap, hidden under my blanket, and studied their faces. My father was avoiding eye contact, focusing intently on unpacking containers of rice and beans. My mother was arranging flowers with unnecessary precision, her movements quick and nervous. "It was fine," I said quietly. "Mom, can I ask you something?" She looked up, and for just a moment, fear flickered across her features. "Of course, baby. What is it?" I pulled the report from under my blanket and set it on the bedside table where they could both see it. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. My father's face went gray, and my mother's hands stilled on the flower stems. They looked at each other in the way couples do when they've been caught in a lie they thought was buried forever. "Alina," my father started, his voice rough, "where did you get that?" "Does it matter?" I asked.
What matters is what's in it. What matters is that you knew Uncle Marcus was drunk when he ran over me, and you decided to protect him instead of me. My mother sank into the visitor's chair like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. "Mija, you don't understand. The situation was complicated. Marcus was devastated, and pressing charges wouldn't have brought your legs back. We thought it was better to focus on your recovery, on moving forward." "Moving forward," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. "You mean moving forward without justice, without accountability, without anyone admitting that what happened to me was preventable."
My father finally met my eyes, and I saw guilt there, but also defensiveness. Elena, Marcus is family. He made a terrible mistake, but destroying his life wouldn't have helped yours. We thought it was better to focus on your recovery, on moving forward. Moving forward? I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. You mean moving forward without justice, without accountability, without anyone admitting that what happened to me was preventable. My father finally met my eyes, and I saw guilt there, but also defensiveness. Elena, Marcus is family. He made a terrible mistake, but destroying his life wouldn't have helped yours. We made the best decision we could with the information we had. The best decision for who? I asked, because it wasn't the best decision for me. I'm the one who's going to spend the rest of my life in this chair because Uncle Marcus chose to drink and drive in Grandma's driveway. I'm the one who's going to need hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical care and equipment. I'm the one whose life was destroyed, but somehow the decision about whether to hold him accountable wasn't mine to make. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with shaking hands. We were trying to protect you, she whispered, from the stress of legal proceedings, from having to relive the trauma. We thought if we handled it quietly, you could heal without all that additional pain. You were trying to protect Marcus, I said, and the clarity of it felt like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. You were protecting his business, his reputation, his freedom, and you decided that was more important than protecting me. The takeout containers sat untouched on the bedside table, the smell of cumin and cilantro mixing with the antiseptic air in a combination that would forever remind me of this moment. My parents sat in their chairs like defendants waiting for a verdict, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I held the power in our relationship. I want you to leave, I said quietly. Elena, please, my father started. I want you to leave now, I repeated, my voice stronger this time. And I want you to call Uncle Marcus and tell him that I know the truth. Tell him that I'm going to do what you should have done 3 months ago. I'm going to hold him accountable. My mother stood on unsteady legs, her face pale and streaked with mascara. What are you going to do? I'm going to call Sophia, I said, and I'm going to sue him for everything he's worth. And if you try to stop me or convince me otherwise, you'll lose me completely. Do you understand? They left without another word, taking their flowers and their food and their guilty secrets with them. I sat alone in the mechanical bed, holding a police report that had changed everything, and felt a strange sense of freedom settling over me like a blanket. For months, I'd been the victim in this story, the tragic figure everyone pitied and protected and made decisions for. But victims don't have to stay victims forever. Sometimes they become something else entirely. Sometimes they become the ones who refuse to let the truth stay buried. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Sophia's number. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the surprise in her voice when I spoke. Sophia, I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. Remember what you said about the lawsuit, about making sure I'm protected? I'm ready to talk. There was a pause, and then she said quietly, "What changed your mind?" I replied, "And now everyone else is going to learn it too." The next few weeks transformed my hospital room into a war room. Sophia arrived with legal documents and a laptop, turning the small space into a makeshift law office, where we planned what she called our strategy and what I called justice. She'd brought along a senior partner from her firm, a woman named Catherine Rivera, who had silver hair and steel eyes, and a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Catherine was the kind of attorney who wore expensive suits and spoke in measured sentences, but when she looked at my medical files and the police report, her professional composure cracked just enough to let me see the anger underneath. "This is unconscionable," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "A drunk driving incident covered up by the victim's own family. The insurance fraud implications alone are staggering, never mind the personal injury aspects." I'd been learning a new vocabulary over the past weeks, legal terms that felt foreign on my tongue but essential to my future. Negligence, liability, compensatory damages, punitive damages.
Each word represented a piece of my life that had been stolen and might be recovered, translated into dollar amounts that could never make me whole, but could make my future possible. Sophia had been working quietly, gathering evidence that went far beyond the police report. She'd interviewed Mrs. Patterson, who confirmed that Uncle Marcus had been drinking in his truck for at least 20 minutes before the accident. She'd obtained his phone records, which showed he'd been texting while backing up. She'd even found security camera footage from the house across the street that clearly showed the yellow blanket I'd been lying on, bright and unmistakable in the afternoon sun. Each piece of evidence felt like vindication, proof that my growing certainty about what happened wasn't paranoid or ungrateful or any of the other things I'd been afraid of feeling. Uncle Marcus had been drunk, distracted, and reckless, and my family had decided that protecting him was more important than protecting me. But the hardest evidence to process was what Sophia found when she dug into Uncle Marcus's history. This wasn't his first incident involving alcohol in vehicles. 2 years earlier, he'd been pulled over for suspected DUI, but the charges had been dropped due to a technical issue with the breathalyzer. 6 months before my accident, he'd been involved in a minor fender bender where the other driver reported smelling alcohol, but no charges were filed because Uncle Marcus claimed he'd only had 1 beer with lunch. My family knew he was a dangerous drunk driver, and they'd protected him then too. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone. Every family gathering where I'd watched him drink beer after beer, every time someone had taken his keys away as a joke, every whispered conversation about Marcus needing to slow down his drinking, they all took on new meaning. My paralysis wasn't just the result of one terrible decision. It was the inevitable outcome of years of enabling and excusing and looking the other way. Catherine filed the lawsuit on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months after my accident and 1 month after I'd learned the truth. She'd warned me that Uncle Marcus would have 10 days to respond, that his lawyers would probably try to settle out of court, that the process could take years to resolve fully. But I wasn't thinking about timelines or settlements. I was thinking about the moment when Uncle Marcus would have to sit in a courtroom and answer questions about why he'd chosen to drink and drive in his own mother's driveway, why he'd destroyed his niece's life for the sake of a few beers and a text message. The news traveled through my family like wildfire. My phone started ringing within hours of the lawsuit being filed. A parade of relatives who'd never called me in the hospital, suddenly desperate to share their opinions about my decision. My Aunt Carmen called first, her voice shrill with indignation. "Elena, how could you do this to Marcus? He's been eaten alive with guilt since the accident. This lawsuit will destroy him financially. Is that really what you want?" "What I want is justice," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "What I want is for someone to admit that what happened to me was preventable and wrong." "But he's family," she said, like that settled everything. "Family doesn't sue family. We handle these things privately, with love and forgiveness." "Family doesn't cover up drunk driving incidents either," I said, "but that's exactly what you all did." She hung up without saying goodbye, but the calls kept coming. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me since high school suddenly had strong opinions about my character. Uncles who'd never visited me in the hospital called to lecture me about loyalty and forgiveness. Even my grandmother, frail and confused at 87, was convinced to call and beg me to reconsider. The only call that mattered came from my parents. My father's voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, defeated in a way that might have broken my heart if I still trusted him with it. "Elena," he said, "we need to talk. Can we come see you?" "We can talk on this phone," I replied. "I think that's best for now." There was a long pause, and then my mother's voice joined the conversation. She must have been listening on another extension, and she sounded like she'd been crying for days. "Mija, please reconsider this lawsuit. Marcus has agreed to pay all your medical bills directly. He wants to set up a fund for your ongoing care. We can handle this as a family without bringing lawyers and courts into it." I almost laughed, but it came out bitter instead. "Now you want to handle it as a family? After you handled it by covering up his crime? After you made decisions about my life without consulting me? Now, when I'm finally making my own choices, you want family input?" "It's not about the money," my father said quietly. "It's about what this is going to do to all of us. The lawsuit will become public. There will be news stories, court proceedings. Everyone will know our business. And there it was, the truth beneath all their concern and pleading. They weren't worried about Uncle Marcus's guilt or my well-being or even justice. They were worried about embarrassment, about the family name, about having their dirty secrets displayed in court documents and news articles for everyone to see. "Dad," I said, my voice gentle, because I realized this might be the last real conversation we ever had. "I've spent 3 months learning to live in a world where I'll never walk again. I've had to accept that my entire future has changed, that everything I planned for myself is gone, that I'll need help for the rest of my life with things I used to take for granted. I've accepted all of that because I thought it was a tragic accident. But it wasn't an accident. It was a crime that you helped cover up. So forgive me if I'm not worried about family embarrassment anymore." My mother made a sound like a sob. "Alina, we love you. Everything we did because we love you, and we wanted to protect you." "You wanted to protect yourselves," I said, "and Uncle Marcus. The person you didn't protect was me, the person whose protection mattered most in this situation." After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my hospital room and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, and certainly not joy, but a deep, settling peace that came from finally telling the truth, from finally standing up for myself, from finally refusing to let other people make decisions about my life because they thought they knew better. The lawsuit moved forward with mechanical precision. Uncle Marcus's lawyers filed motions and responses, trying to minimize his liability, trying to argue that the family's decision not to press criminal charges proved the incident was truly accidental. Catherine countered with evidence and expert testimony, building a case that was so airtight even I was surprised by its strength. The depositions were scheduled for December, and as the date approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating the moment when I'd finally face Uncle Marcus across a conference table with lawyers and court reporters and the weight of legal truth settling over everything we said. But before the depositions could take place, something happened that I hadn't expected. Sophia called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with excitement and anger in equal measure. "Alina," she said, "you need to sit down. Catherine just got a call from Marcus's attorney. He wants to settle. Full settlement, no admission of guilt, but a substantial monetary agreement that would cover all your current and future medical needs, plus punitive damages." I felt my heart racing, though I wasn't sure if it was from relief or disappointment. How substantial? $2.4 million, she said, paid out over 15 years, with provisions for inflation and additional medical needs. It's more than we expected to get, even if we won at trial. I closed my eyes and tried to process what she was telling me. $2.4 million? Enough money to ensure I'd never have to worry about medical care, about accessibility modifications, about the thousand small expenses that came with living in a wheelchair. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to completely change the trajectory of my life. But it came with a price. No admission of guilt meant Uncle Marcus would never have to publicly acknowledge what he'd done. No trial meant no testimony, no public record of his drunk driving, no legal consequences beyond writing checks. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Sophia was quiet for a moment. "Elena, this is a good settlement, a really good settlement. You'd be set for life, and you'd avoid years of legal proceedings that could be emotionally exhausting. But I know this was never just about money for you. It was about justice, about truth, about holding him accountable." She was right. The money was important, crucial even for my future independence. But the money wasn't why I'd filed the lawsuit. I'd filed it because I was tired of being the person everyone made decisions for, tired of watching the truth get buried because it was inconvenient, tired of letting Uncle Marcus walk away from the worst thing he'd ever done with nothing more than guilt and a promise to pay my medical bills. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course," Sophia said. "But, Elena, there's something else you should know. Catherine thinks this settlement offer means Marcus's lawyers know they can't win at trial. They've seen our evidence, and they're scared. This isn't a gesture of goodwill. This is panic."
After we hung up, I called the one person whose opinion mattered more to me than anyone else's. Maya answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting for my call. "Elena," she said, her voice warm with relief. "I've been thinking about you all day. How are you holding up?" I told her about the settlement offer, about the money and the lack of admission of guilt, about the choice between financial security and legal vindication. Maya listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for so long I wondered if she'd fallen asleep. Finally, she spoke, and her voice carried the same determination I remembered from college, when she'd helped me study for exams I thought I'd fail and convince me I was stronger than I believed. "Elena," she said, "remember when we were seniors and you wanted to quit your internship because your supervisor was treating you like garbage? Remember what you told me when I suggested you should just suck it up and finish the semester?" I smiled despite everything. "I told you that sometimes accepting unfair treatment teaches people that unfairness is acceptable." "Exactly," Maya said. "You said that if you let him walk all over you, he'd just keep walking all over other interns until someone finally stood up to him. This feels like the same thing. If you let Marcus pay his way out of consequences, what does that teach him? What does that teach your family? What does that teach the next person who might be lying on a blanket in someone's driveway?" She was right, and I'd known it before I even called her. The settlement was tempting because it was safe, because it would let me move on with my life without the uncertainty and publicity of a trial. But safe wasn't the same as right, and I'd spent too many months learning to be strong again to choose safe over right now. I called Sophia the next morning and told her to reject the settlement offer. I wanted my day in court. I wanted Uncle Marcus to sit in a witness chair and answer questions about his drinking, about his choices, about the yellow blanket he claimed not to see. I wanted a jury to hear the evidence and decide whether justice meant more than just writing a check. Sophia didn't try to change my mind, though I could hear concern in her voice. "Are you prepared for this to get ugly?" she asked. "Marcus's lawyers are going to try to discredit you, to argue that you're bitter and vindictive, that you're trying to destroy an innocent man's life. They're going to make this personal," I replied. "They made it personal when they decided to protect him instead of me." The trial was scheduled for March, 6 months away. As winter settled over the city and I continued my physical therapy and the rehabilitation center where I'd been transferred, I felt a strange sense of anticipation building. Not excitement exactly, but purpose. For the first time since the accident, I was moving towards something instead of just trying to survive each day. My family made one last attempt to change my mind. They organized what they called an intervention, though it felt more like an ambush. My parents, my aunts and uncles, even my grandmother were there, gathered in the rehabilitation center's family conference room like a tribunal. Uncle Marcus wasn't there, but his presence filled the empty chair at the head of the table. My cousin David, who'd appointed himself the family spokesperson, cleared his throat and began what sounded like a prepared speech about forgiveness and moving forward and the damage I was causing to everyone who loved me. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd used since we were children, "we understand that you're angry. We understand that you feel betrayed. But this lawsuit isn't just hurting Marcus, it's hurting all of us. It's tearing our family apart." I looked around the table at faces I'd loved my entire life, at people who'd been at every birthday party and graduation and Christmas dinner, and felt a sadness so deep it was almost physical. They still didn't understand. Even now, even after everything, they still thought this was about anger or revenge or family loyalty. "David," I said quietly, "do you know what it's like to wake up every morning and remember all over again that your legs don't work? Do you know what it's like to need help getting dressed, getting in and out of bed, reaching things on high shelves? Do you know what it's like to realize that your entire future has changed because someone made a selfish, preventable choice?" His face softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "We know it's been hard, Elena, but destroying Marcus won't make it easier." "I'm not trying to destroy him," I replied. "I'm trying to hold him accountable. There's a difference." My Aunt Carmen leaned forward, her eyes bright with tears. "Elena, Marcus has been like a father to you. Remember when you were 8 and wanted that expensive bike for Christmas? Remember who bought it for you when your parents couldn't afford it? Remember who taught you to drive, who helped you with your college applications. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts for everything, I said, and my voice broke slightly on the words. That's what makes this so much worse. Someone who claimed to love me chose to drink and drive and destroy my life. Someone who was supposed to protect me needed protecting from me instead. The meeting ended without resolution, with tears and accusations and the bitter taste of relationships that couldn't survive the weight of truth. They filed out one by one, some hugging me goodbye and others leaving without a word, and I sat alone in the conference room wondering if this was what justice felt like, empty and necessary and heartbreaking all at once. The trial began on a Tuesday in March, with jury selection and opening statements that laid out two very different versions of the same story. Uncle Marcus's lawyer painted him as a grieving man who'd made a tragic mistake and had suffered enough. Catherine painted him as a habitual drunk driver whose reckless choices had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. I sat in my wheelchair at the plaintiff's table, wearing a navy blue dress that Maya had helped me pick out, trying to look strong and credible and deserving of justice. Across the aisle, Uncle Marcus sat with his lawyers, looking smaller than I remembered, grayer and more fragile. When our eyes met for the first time in months, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not defiance or anger, but resignation. He knew he was going to lose. The evidence was devastating. The police report, the witness statements, the security camera footage, the phone records showing he'd been texting while backing up. Catherine presented it all with clinical precision, building a case so airtight that even Uncle Marcus's lawyers seemed to be going through the motions rather than mounting a real defense. But the most powerful moment came when Catherine called me to testify. I'd been dreading this for months, the moment when I'd have to relive the worst day of my life in front of strangers, when I'd have to describe the sound of my bones breaking and the feeling of being abandoned by my own family. Catherine guided me through my testimony with gentle questions, letting me tell my story in my own words. I talked about the accident, about learning the truth from the police report, about my family's decision to cover up Uncle Marcus's crime. I talked about the months of rehabilitation, about learning to live in a wheelchair, about the future I'd lost and the one I was trying to build. When Uncle Marcus's lawyer cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as vindictive and money-hungry, but his questions felt weak and desperate. How could he argue that I was being unreasonable when the evidence was so clear, when the facts spoke for themselves? The most difficult moment came when he asked me if I'd ever forgiven Uncle Marcus, if I'd ever considered that he was suffering too. I looked across the courtroom at my uncle, at this man who'd been part of my life for 22 years, who'd taught me to parallel park and helped me with calculus homework and given me advice about boys I thought I loved. I thought about forgiveness, about what it meant and whether it was something I owed him or something I owed myself. I don't know if I've forgiven him, I said honestly, but I know that forgiveness and accountability aren't the same thing. You can forgive someone and still expect them to face consequences for their actions. You can love someone and still refuse to let them hurt you without penalty. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the foreman's voice was steady and clear as he read the decision that would change everything. Guilty of negligence. Guilty of reckless endangerment. The monetary award was even larger than the settlement offer had been, $3.7 million plus punitive damages that brought the total to just over $5 million. But the money wasn't what made Uncle Marcus's face crumble as he sat beside his lawyers. It wasn't what made my Aunt Carmen sob in the gallery behind him. It was the public acknowledgement of what he'd done, the legal record that would follow him forever, the admission of guilt that no amount of family pressure had been able to prevent. Catherine squeezed my shoulder as the judge dismissed the jury, her voice warm with satisfaction when she leaned down to whisper, "We did it, Elena. We got justice." I nodded, but the word justice felt different now that I had it, less triumphant than I'd expected, more complicated. Watching Uncle Marcus walk out of that courtroom with his shoulders bent under the weight of his conviction, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Not regret exactly, but sadness.
the kind of deep, bone-tired sadness that comes from winning a battle you never wanted to fight. Maya was waiting for me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her eyes bright with tears and fierce pride. She wrapped her arms around me from behind my wheelchair, holding me tight while reporters asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, and courthouse staff cleared the hallway of spectators. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly, her voice meant only for me. "Like the end of something," I replied, "but also like the beginning." The news coverage was extensive. Local papers picked up the story first, with headlines about family betrayal and drunk driving cover-ups that made my private pain feel suddenly public. Then national outlets began calling, wanting to know more about the woman who'd sued her own uncle, about the family that had chosen loyalty over justice, about the collision between love and accountability that had torn us all apart. I declined most of the interview requests, but I did agree to speak with one journalist, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who wrote for a magazine focused on legal reform. She met me at the rehabilitation center on a quiet Thursday afternoon, her manner professional but kind, her questions thoughtful rather than sensational. "What do you want people to understand about your decision to sue?" she asked, her recorder placed carefully between us on the small table in the family meeting room. I'd been thinking about that question for months, since the first moment I decided to call Sophia and ask about legal options. "I want them to understand that accountability and love aren't opposites," I said. "You can love someone deeply and still refuse to let them hurt you without consequences. In fact, sometimes holding someone accountable is the most loving thing you can do, because it gives them a chance to face the truth about their actions and maybe change." Rebecca nodded, making notes in the margins of her notepad. "Your family has been very vocal about feeling betrayed by your lawsuit. They've given several interviews suggesting that you chose money over family loyalty. How do you respond to that?" The criticism had been painful, especially coming from people I'd loved my entire life. My parents had appeared on a local morning show, speaking carefully about their disappointment and their hope that our family could heal from this difficult time. They'd been diplomatic, but the subtext was clear. I was the one who'd chosen to tear the family apart. "Money was never the point," I said. "Yes, I need financial security to live with my disability, and yes, the settlement will help with that. But I could have accepted Uncle Marcus's private offers to pay my medical bills. I chose the lawsuit because I wanted the truth to be acknowledged publicly. I wanted there to be consequences for drunk driving, even when the victim is family." Catherine squeezed my shoulder as the judge dismissed the jury, her voice warm with satisfaction when she leaned down to whisper, "We did it, Elena. We got justice." I nodded, but the word justice felt different now that I had it, less triumphant than I'd expected, more complicated. Watching Uncle Marcus walk out of that courtroom with his shoulders bent under the weight of his conviction, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Not regret exactly, but sadness. The kind of deep, bone-tired sadness that comes from winning a battle you never wanted to fight. Maya was waiting for me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her eyes bright with tears and fierce pride. She wrapped her arms around me from behind my wheelchair, holding me tight while reporters asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, and courthouse staff cleared the hallway of spectators. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly, her voice meant only for me. "Like the end of something," I replied, "but also like the beginning." The news coverage was extensive. Local papers picked up the story first, with headlines about family betrayal and drunk driving cover-ups that made my private pain feel suddenly public. Then national outlets began calling, wanting to know more about the woman who'd sued her own uncle, about the family that had chosen loyalty over justice, about the collision between love and accountability that had torn us all apart. I declined most of the interview requests, but I did agree to speak with one journalist, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who wrote for a magazine focused on legal reform. She met me at the rehabilitation center on a quiet Thursday afternoon, her manner professional but kind, her questions thoughtful rather than sensational. "What do you want people to understand about your decision to sue?" she asked, her recorder placed carefully between us on the small table in the family meeting room. I'd been thinking about that question for months, since the first moment I'd decided to call Sophia and ask about legal options. "I want them to understand that accountability and love aren't opposites," I said. "You can love someone deeply and still refuse to let them hurt you without consequences.
In fact, sometimes holding someone accountable is the most loving thing you can do because it gives them a chance to face the truth about their actions and maybe change. Rebecca nodded, making notes in the margins of her notepad. Your family has been very vocal about feeling betrayed by your lawsuit. They've given several interviews suggesting that you chose money over family loyalty. How do you respond to that? The criticism had been painful, especially coming from people I'd loved my entire life. My parents had appeared on a local morning show, speaking carefully about their disappointment and their hope that our family could heal from this difficult time. They'd been diplomatic, but the subtext was clear. I was the one who'd chosen to tear the family apart. Money was never the point, I said. Yes, I need financial security to live with my disability, and yes, the settlement will help with, especially when the victim is family. The article came out 6 weeks later, a thoughtful piece about the intersection of family loyalty and personal justice that sparked conversations I hadn't expected. I received letters from readers who'd faced similar situations, people who'd been hurt by family members and struggled with whether to seek accountability or maintain relationships. Some supported my decision, others criticized it, but all of them seemed to understand that the choice hadn't been simple or easy. One letter stood out from all the others. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, with no return address on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message written in blue ink. Elena, my name is Jennifer Walsh. 3 years ago, my brother drove drunk and killed a pedestrian. Our family convinced the victim's family not to press charges, said it would destroy my brother's life and that he'd already learned his lesson. Last week, he drove drunk again and hit a school bus. 2 children died. I keep thinking that if we hadn't protected him the first time, if there had been real consequences, maybe those children would still be alive. Thank you for choosing accountability over comfort. You probably saved lives. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, where I kept important documents. It was a reminder that my decision had implications beyond my own healing, that sometimes the courage to hold someone accountable ripples outward in ways you never expect. Spring turned to summer, and I finally moved out of the rehabilitation center into an apartment that had been modified for wheelchair accessibility. Maya helped me pack my few belongings, and Catherine connected me with a financial advisor who specialized in managing settlement funds for people with disabilities. For the first time in over a year, I was truly independent, living alone but not lonely, building a life that was mine rather than one that had been shaped entirely by my accident and its aftermath. The estrangement from my family deepened during those months. My parents made a few attempts at reconciliation, tentative phone calls and greeting cards on my birthday, but the conversations felt strained and artificial. Too much had been said and done and left unsaid for us to simply return to the relationship we'd had before. They'd made a choice to protect Uncle Marcus instead of me, and I'd made a choice to protect myself instead of them. Both choices had consequences that couldn't be undone with apologies or good intentions. Sophia visited me regularly during those first months in my new apartment. She'd finished law school and passed the bar exam, and she often talked about how working on my case had shaped her understanding of what justice actually meant. She was dating someone new, a woman named Carmen, who worked as a social worker and understood the complexities of family trauma in ways that felt familiar and comforting. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked one evening as we sat on my accessible balcony, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of orange and gold. The lawsuit, the trial, all of it. I considered the question carefully. Regret was too simple a word for the complex emotions I carried about my choice. There were moments when I missed the illusion of family unity, when I wished I could still believe that Uncle Marcus's actions had been a pure accident, and my family's response had been motivated only by love. But those moments of nostalgic sadness were always followed by a deeper sense of peace about choosing truth over comfort. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that Uncle Marcus chose to drink and drive. I regret that my family chose to cover it up. But I don't regret refusing to let those choices go unacknowledged. I spent so many years being the person everyone made decisions for, the one who was expected to accept whatever happened to me without complaint. This was the first time I chose for myself, even when that choice was difficult and painful." Sophia nodded, understanding flickering in her dark eyes.
Working on your case taught me something important about family. Blood doesn't make people trustworthy. Love doesn't excuse harmful behavior. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who claim to be protecting us. That conversation stayed with me as summer faded into autumn. I'd started working part-time for a nonprofit organization that advocated for people with disabilities, using my settlement money to supplement the modest salary so I could focus on meaningful work rather than financial necessity. The job involved counseling people who were navigating the early stages of life with acquired disabilities, helping them understand their rights and options in situations that often felt overwhelming and impossible. Many of my clients had stories that echoed parts of my own: families who made medical decisions without consulting them, insurance companies that denied necessary equipment, employers who suddenly discovered reasons to terminate employees who returned to work with disabilities. The common thread in all their stories was the same one I'd experienced: other people making choices about their lives based on what was convenient or comfortable rather than what was right or necessary. I found purpose in that work, in using my own painful education about advocacy and accountability to help others navigate similar challenges. It wasn't the career I'd planned before my accident, but it felt more meaningful than anything I'd imagined doing with my marketing degree. Sometimes the life you don't plan turns out to be more authentic than the one you did. One October afternoon, I received a phone call that I'd been both expecting and dreading. Uncle Marcus was on the other end, his voice smaller and rougher than I remembered, asking if he could see me. "I know I don't have the right to ask," he said, the words coming out rushed and nervous. "I know you probably never want to see me again, but I've been going to AA, and part of the program is making amends to people you've hurt. I can't make amends for what I did to you, I know that, but I'd like to try to explain, if you'll let me." I sat in my kitchen, holding the phone and staring out the window at the tree-lined street where I'd built my new life, trying to decide whether seeing him would help or hurt the healing I'd been working on for months. Part of me was curious about what he might say, what explanation he could offer for the choices he'd made. Another part of me was afraid that seeing him would undo some of the peace I'd found in moving forward. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "Can I call you back in a few days?" He agreed, giving me his number and thanking me for even considering his request. After we hung up, I called Maya and asked her to come over. She arrived within an hour, bringing takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and the kind of direct honesty that had always been one of her most valuable qualities. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked as we ate pad thai on my couch, her legs tucked under her in the casual way that had become natural again after months of spending time together. "My gut says it won't change anything," I replied. "Whatever he says, whatever explanation he offers, it won't give me my legs back or undo the family betrayal or make the last year and a half disappear. So the question is whether hearing him out will help me somehow or just reopen wounds that are finally starting to heal." Maya nodded thoughtfully, twirling noodles around her fork while she considered. "Remember in college when that professor tried to get you to change your thesis topic because he thought it was too controversial? You spent weeks agonizing over whether to stick with your original idea or switch to something safer." I smiled, remembering the late-night conversations in our dorm room about academic integrity and personal conviction. "You told me that avoiding difficult conversations doesn't make them go away. It just means someone else gets to control the narrative." "Exactly, and you ended up winning that undergraduate research award because you stuck with the topic that mattered to you, even though it was harder to defend." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "This feels similar. You can avoid this conversation with Marcus, and that would be completely valid. But if you think there's any possibility that hearing what he has to say might help you move forward, then maybe it's worth the risk." I called Uncle Marcus back 3 days later and agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my apartment. Neutral territory, public enough that I'd feel safe, but private enough for honest conversation. He arrived first and was waiting at a corner table when I rolled through the entrance, looking older than his 55 years and wearing a flannel shirt I remembered from family barbecues that felt like they'd happened in a different lifetime. He stood when he saw me, then sat back down awkwardly, seeming unsure of the social protocols for greeting a niece you'd paralyzed and hadn't spoken to since she'd sued you into bankruptcy. I navigated my wheelchair to the table and positioned myself across from him, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," I replied honestly, "but I decided that I'm strong enough now to hear whatever you need to say." He nodded, staring down at his hands wrapped around the coffee mug. "I've been sober for 4 months," he said. "Started going to meetings right after the trial ended. The lawyer said it might help with the appeal, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I finally understand what my drinking cost all of us." I waited, not wanting to make this easier for him by responding too quickly or offering reassurance he hadn't earned. "The day of the accident," he continued, his voice getting stronger, "I'd been drinking since noon. Started with a couple of beers while I was working in Mom's yard, then had more at lunch, then sat in my truck for another hour drinking and checking my phone because I didn't want to go inside and pretend to be sober around the family." The admission hung between us like smoke. I'd known from the police report that he'd been drinking, but hearing him describe the progression of his day, the deliberate choices he'd made to keep drinking, even knowing he'd have to drive, made the crime feel more real and more terrible. "I saw your blanket," he said, looking up at me for the first time since he'd started talking. "When I started backing up, I saw it in my rearview mirror. Bright yellow, just like you always said. And I thought, Elena's behind the truck. I need to be careful. But I was drunk and looking at my phone, and I forgot to be careful. I forgot you were there." The words hit me like physical blows. All this time, I'd wondered whether he'd truly not seen me, whether the accident had been the result of genuine oversight or criminal negligence. Now I knew. He'd seen me. He'd been aware I was there, and he'd chosen to text and drive anyway. "Why didn't you tell the truth then?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "When the police asked what happened, when the family was deciding whether to press charges, why didn't you tell them that you saw me and backed over me anyway?" His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the uncle I remembered from childhood, the one who'd taught me to bait fishing hooks and helped me build a treehouse in my parents' backyard. "Because I was scared," he whispered. "Because I knew that if I admitted I'd seen you, if I told the truth about how drunk I was, I'd go to prison. And I was selfish enough to let you suffer rather than face the consequences of what I'd done." I sat in that coffee shop, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of normal life, and felt a strange sense of completion. For over a year, I'd been living with questions about his motivations, about whether the accident had been truly accidental or the result of criminal negligence. Now I had my answer, and it was worse than I'd imagined, but also somehow easier to accept than the uncertainty had been. "The family knew," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded miserably. "Your dad knew I'd been drinking all day. Your mom knew. They all knew, but they also knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy me and tear the family apart. So they chose to protect me instead of demanding justice for you. And you let them?" "I let them. I sat there in that hospital room while you were in surgery, letting them plan how to handle the situation so I wouldn't face criminal charges. I told myself I was in shock, that I wasn't thinking clearly. But the truth is, I was relieved. I was grateful that they were willing to cover for me. The confession should have made me angrier, should have reopened wounds that had been slowly healing. Instead, I felt a deep calm settling over me. The truth was finally complete. No gaps or questions or nagging doubts about what had really happened that July afternoon in my grandmother's driveway. "I don't forgive you," I said quietly, and watched him flinch as if I'd slapped him. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because forgiveness isn't something you get to ask for or demand. It's something I might choose to give you someday, but not because you've apologized or gone to AA or admitted the truth. If I ever forgive you, it will be because forgiveness helps me heal, not because it helps you feel better about what you did." He nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm trying to make sure I never hurt anyone else the way I hurt you." "Then stay sober," I said, reaching for my purse to signal that our conversation was over. "Don't just go to meetings when you feel guilty. Stay sober because drunk drivers kill people, and you've already destroyed enough lives." I left him sitting at that table, crying into his coffee cup, and rolled out into the afternoon sunshine feeling lighter than I had in months. The meeting hadn't given me closure in the way I'd expected, but it had given me something more valuable: certainty. I knew exactly what had happened to me, exactly who was responsible,
and exactly why my family had chosen to protect him instead of me. There were no more questions to answer, no more doubts to resolve. That evening, I called my parents for the first time since the trial. My mother answered, and I could hear the hope and fear warring her fingers when she said my name. "Elena, Mija, how are you?" "I'm good, Mom," I said, and meant it. "I saw Marcus today. He told me the truth about the accident, about what really happened." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, my father's voice joined the conversation, rough with emotion. "Elena, we can explain. We were trying to protect everyone, trying to find a solution that wouldn't destroy the whole family." "I know why you did it," I said calmly. "I understand your motivations. But I also understand that you chose to protect the person who hurt me instead of the person who was hurt. And I can't pretend that choice didn't happen, or that it doesn't matter, just because time has passed." My mother was crying now, the quiet kind of crying that sounds like breaking glass. "What can we do? How can we fix this?" "You can't fix it," I replied, and the words felt like mercy rather than cruelty. "Some things can't be fixed, Mom. They can only be accepted and learned from. You made a choice that prioritized Marcus's well-being over mine, and I made a choice to seek justice anyway. We both have to live with the consequences of our choices." "Does this mean you'll never forgive us?" my father asked, his voice small and defeated. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe someday, but not because you want me to, and not because we're family. If I ever forgive you, it will be because I'm ready to, because it helps me move forward with my life. And right now, moving forward means accepting that our relationship is different than it used to be." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony as the sun set behind the city skyline, thinking about forgiveness and family and the complicated mathematics of love and harm. I thought about the letters I'd received from strangers who'd found strength in my story, about the clients I worked with who were learning to advocate for themselves, about the life I was building that felt more authentic and purposeful than anything I'd planned before my accident. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "How did it go with Marcus?" I typed back quickly. "Better than expected. I'll tell you about it when you come over tomorrow." But first, I had something else to do. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document, then began typing words that had been forming in my mind for months, a story that needed to be told, not for revenge or vindication, but for all the people who were still learning that love and accountability could coexist, that family loyalty didn't have to mean accepting harm without consequences. The story began with a question. What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect you choose to protect someone else instead? And it ended with an answer I'd learned the hard way. You learn to protect yourself, and in doing so, you become the person you always had the potential to be. I wrote through the night, telling my story not as a victim's narrative, but as a survivor's guide, a map for anyone who'd ever had to choose between family peace and personal justice. When I finished, as dawn light crept through my windows, I had the beginning of something that felt like more than just my own experience. I had a blueprint for transformation, a testament to the possibility of choosing yourself, even when everyone else chooses someone else. The piece was published 6 months later in a national magazine focused on social justice issues. It sparked conversations about family loyalty, accountability, and the courage required to seek justice when doing so comes at enormous personal cost. I received hundreds of emails from readers who recognized their own experiences in my words, people who'd been hurt by family members and struggled with whether to maintain relationships or seek accountability. But the response that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, the woman who'd written to me about her brother's drunk driving, sent another letter. This one was longer, more detailed, filled with updates about her own journey toward healing and her work with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. "Your story gave me the courage to speak publicly about my family's mistakes," she wrote. "I've been sharing our story at MAD events, talking about how protecting drunk drivers enables them to keep driving drunk. 3 people have approached me after my talks to say they're no longer covering for alcoholic family members. You probably saved more lives than you'll ever know." I folded that letter carefully and placed it next to the first one she'd sent, a reminder that courage can be contagious. that choosing accountability over comfort creates ripples that extend far beyond our own healing. Winter arrived early that year, with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping below freezing before Thanksgiving. I'd been invited to spend the holiday with Maya's family, who'd embraced me as one of their own without the complicated history that made my own family dinners feel like minefields. It would be my first major holiday completely separate from my biological family, and I approached it with a mixture of sadness and relief. The morning of Thanksgiving, as I was getting ready to go to Maya's parents' house, I received an unexpected visitor. Sophia arrived at my door carrying a small potted plant and wearing the kind of serious expression that usually meant important news. "I have something to tell you," she said, after I'd invited her in and made coffee. "Something about Marcus that I thought you should know." I settled into my wheelchair across from her, noting the way she was choosing her words carefully. "What is it?" "He was arrested last week," she said gently. "DUI, third offense. He's looking at serious prison time now, probably 3 to 5 years." The news hit me like a physical blow, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. Despite his promises about sobriety, despite his AA meetings and his tearful apology in the coffee shop, Uncle Marcus had made the same choice again. He'd chosen alcohol over safety, selfishness over accountability, and this time there were no family members willing or able to protect him. "Was anyone hurt?" I asked, dreading the answer. "No," Sophia said quickly. "He was pulled over before he hit anything or anyone. The officer said he was swerving across lanes on the highway, but he didn't cause an accident." I closed my eyes and felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over me. Relief that no one had been hurt, sadness that Uncle Marcus had proven incapable of the change he'd promised, vindication for my decision to seek legal accountability rather than accepting his private apologies, and underneath it all, a deep tiredness of the predictable tragedy of addiction and enabling and the cycles of harm they create. "How do you feel about it?" Sophia asked quietly. "Like I made the right choice," I said after a long moment. If I hadn't sued him, if I'd accepted the family's approach of handling things privately, he would have learned that drunk driving doesn't have real consequences. He would have kept drinking and driving until he killed someone. At least now, when he inevitably faces criminal charges, there will be a legal record of his pattern of behavior. Sophia nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. "The prosecutor called Catherine yesterday. They want to use evidence from your civil case in their criminal proceedings against him. Your lawsuit created a paper trail that proves this wasn't an isolated incident." "Good," I said, and meant it. Maybe this time he'll face consequences that actually match the severity of his choices. After Sophia left, I sat in my apartment thinking about cycles and consequences, about the ways that accountability can interrupt patterns of harm that might otherwise continue indefinitely. My lawsuit hadn't just been about seeking justice for what Uncle Marcus had done to me. It had been about creating a legal record that would protect future victims, about refusing to enable behavior that put innocent people at risk. If I'd accepted the family's approach, if I'd stayed quiet and let them handle things privately, Uncle Marcus would have learned that he could hurt people without facing meaningful consequences. He would have continued drinking and driving, secure in the knowledge that his family would protect him from accountability. Eventually, inevitably, he would have killed someone. Instead, my choice to seek legal justice had created a record of his drunk driving, evidence that would now be used to ensure he faced appropriate criminal charges. My decision to choose accountability over family peace had potentially saved lives by interrupting the cycle of enabling that had allowed his dangerous behavior to continue unchecked. That Thanksgiving, as I sat around Maya's family table listening to conversations about gratitude and reflection, I found myself grateful for things I never could have imagined appreciating. I was grateful for the strength to choose truth over comfort, for friends who became family when my biological family failed me, for the opportunity to use my painful experience to help others navigate similar challenges. I was even grateful, in a complicated way, for my accident and everything that followed. Not because I was glad to be paralyzed, not because I enjoyed the pain and loss and family estrangement that had shaped the last 2 years of my life, but because those experiences had taught me things about courage and authenticity and personal power that I might never have learned otherwise.
Maya's mother, Elena, for whom I'd been named, raised her glass in a toast as the evening wound down. To choosing the hard path when it's the right path, she said, looking directly at me, and to the strength to keep walking that path even when everyone else thinks you should turn back. I raised my glass in response, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love me not despite my choices, but because of them, and felt a kind of peace I'd been searching for since that July afternoon when my world had changed forever. It wasn't the peace of returning to what was, but the deeper peace of becoming who I was meant to be. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, almost 3 years after my accident. I was at my office, reviewing case files for clients who were fighting insurance companies over accessibility modifications, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, belonging to someone who delivered difficult news for a living. Detective Sarah Morrison from the county prosecutor's office wanted to meet with me about Uncle Marcus's criminal case. His third DUI arrest had escalated into something more serious when they discovered he'd been driving with a suspended license, and the prosecutor was building a case that would finally put him behind bars for a significant period of time. I agreed to meet her that afternoon at the courthouse, curious about what role my civil lawsuit might play in his criminal prosecution. Maya offered to come with me, but I declined. This felt like something I needed to face alone, another chapter in a story that had been writing itself for years now. Detective Morrison was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She'd spread my case files across a conference table in the prosecutor's office, documents that told the story of my accident and lawsuit in official language that somehow made the personal feel procedural. "Ms. Vasquez," she said, gesturing for me to join her at the table, "I want to thank you for pursuing your civil case so thoroughly. The evidence your attorney gathered has been invaluable in building our criminal case against your uncle." I positioned my wheelchair across from her, noting how the late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast shadows across the paperwork that had become the official record of my family's destruction. "What exactly are you charging him with?" "Multiple counts," she replied, opening a thick folder. "The new DUI, driving on a suspended license, and we're also pursuing vehicular assault charges related to your accident. Your lawsuit established a pattern of behavior and created a legal record that proves his drunk driving wasn't an isolated incident." The words vehicular assault hung in the air between us like smoke. After all this time, someone in an official capacity was finally calling what happened to me by its real name. Not an accident, not a tragic mistake, but a crime with a perpetrator and a victim and consequences that extended far beyond family dinners and holiday gatherings. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Your testimony, if you're willing to provide it. The civil trial transcript helps, but hearing directly from you about the impact of his actions would strengthen our case considerably." I thought about Uncle Marcus sitting in a jail cell, probably scared and alone, facing the possibility of years in prison for choices he'd made repeatedly despite having every opportunity to change. I thought about my family, likely scrambling to find bail money and hire attorneys, still trying to protect him from consequences he'd earned through his own actions. "I'll testify," I said without hesitation. "When do you need me?" The criminal trial was scheduled for late spring, and as the date approached, I found myself thinking more about justice and closure than I had in months. The civil lawsuit had been about accountability and financial security, about creating a legal record and refusing to let my family's cover-up succeed. But this criminal trial felt different, more final, like the last chapter in a story that had been unfolding since that July afternoon when everything changed. Maya helped me prepare for my testimony, playing the role of opposing counsel as we sat in my apartment rehearsing the questions I might face. She was relentless in her cross-examination, pushing me to remain calm and focused even when the defense attorney tried to paint me as vindictive or money-hungry. "Remember," she said during one of our practice sessions, "your job isn't to convince them that Marcus is a bad person. Your job is to tell the truth about what happened to you and let the jury draw their own conclusions." The night before the trial, I received an unexpected visit from my father. He knocked softly on my door around 8 o'clock, standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands and an expression I hadn't seen since I was a child and had disappointed him in some fundamental way. "Elena," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I invited him in, noting how he seemed to have aged years in the months since we'd last spoken.
His hair was grayer, his shoulders more stooped, his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying secrets and regrets for too long. "I came to ask you not to testify tomorrow," he said. "Not for Marcus, but for the family. This trial is going to tear us apart completely. There won't be any way back from it." I studied his face, looking for traces of the man who'd taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework and made me feel safe in the world when I was small. He was still there, but buried under layers of compromise and enabling and misplaced loyalty that had hardened into something I'd barely recognize. "Dad," I said gently, "the family was already torn apart the moment you all decided to protect Marcus instead of seeking justice for me. This trial isn't destroying anything that wasn't already broken." His hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup, and I realized he was crying, the silent kind of crying that men of his generation tried to hide even from their children. "Elena, he's going to prison, real prison, for years. Is that really what you want?" "What I want is for drunk drivers to face consequences for their choices," I replied. "What I want is for people to stop getting hurt because their families enable dangerous behavior. What I want is for Uncle Marcus to finally understand that actions have consequences, even when the victim is someone who loves you." "He's learned his lesson," my father said desperately. "The civil lawsuit, the financial ruin, losing his business, all of it, he's learned." "Has he?" I asked quietly. "Because he was arrested again for DUI just 6 months ago. If he'd really learned his lesson, if facing consequences in the civil trial had actually changed his behavior, he wouldn't be facing criminal charges now." My father's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw him clearly, probably for the first time in my adult life. He wasn't a monster or a villain. He was just a man who'd made a terrible choice in a moment of crisis and then spent years doubling down on that choice rather than admitting it was wrong. He'd protected his brother-in-law because it was easier than facing the truth about what Marcus had done to me. He'd prioritized family unity over family justice because he couldn't imagine a world where both could coexist. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words coming out broken and small. "I'm sorry we failed you. I'm sorry we chose him over you. I'm sorry it took me this long to see how wrong we were." The apology hung between us in the quiet of my apartment, and I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of anger I'd carried for so long it had become part of my identity. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something softer than the hard fury that had sustained me through the lawsuit and trial and years of family estrangement. "Thank you for saying that," I said carefully. "It means more than you probably know, but it doesn't change what I have to do tomorrow. I have to testify because it's the right thing to do, because drunk driving is a crime that destroys lives, because someone has to speak for all the victims whose families choose silence over justice." He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I understand. And Elena, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the strength you've shown, the life you've built, the person you've become. I should have said that years ago." After he left, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room and felt the strangest sensation, like something heavy was lifting from my shoulders. My father's apology wouldn't change the past or undo the family fractures that had shaped the last 3 years of my life, but it acknowledged the truth of what had happened, validated my choice to seek justice, and offered the possibility that healing might be more complicated and surprising than I'd expected. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early, wearing a navy blue dress that Maya had helped me select, and carrying the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're about to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. The courtroom was smaller than the one where my civil trial had taken place, but it felt more serious somehow, weighted with the gravity of criminal justice rather than monetary settlements. Uncle Marcus sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the suit he'd worn to my civil trial, and his hands were cuffed in front of him. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger or resentment, but resignation. He knew he was going to lose. My testimony lasted 3 hours. The prosecutor guided me through the events of that July afternoon, the discovery of the police report, my family's decision to cover up Uncle Marcus's drunk driving, and the impact his choices had had on every aspect of my life.
I spoke clearly and calmly, describing medical procedures and physical therapy and the daily realities of living with paralysis without seeking pity or dramatic effect. The most difficult moment came when the prosecutor asked me to describe what it felt like to learn that my own family had chosen to protect my uncle instead of seeking justice for me. I took a breath and looked directly at the jury, 12 strangers who would decide whether Uncle Marcus's actions constituted a crime worthy of punishment. It felt like being abandoned twice, I said quietly. Once when he chose to drink and drive and run over my legs, and again when my family chose to protect him from the consequences of that choice. The physical injuries were devastating, but they were something that happened to me. The family betrayal was something they chose to do, and that made it worse in some ways. During cross-examination, Uncle Marcus's attorney tried to paint me as vindictive and money-hungry, suggesting that my testimony was motivated by a desire for revenge rather than justice. He asked whether I'd ever considered that my uncle had suffered enough, whether destroying his life would really help me heal from my injuries. I looked at him steadily and gave the answer I'd been preparing for months. My uncle destroyed his own life by repeatedly choosing to drink and drive. My injuries are permanent, and they've changed every single day of my life since the accident. But his suffering is optional. He can choose to stop drinking, to get treatment for his addiction, to make different decisions about how he lives. I don't have the option to walk again. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Uncle Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years if he completed alcohol treatment programs and maintained sobriety. As the judge read the sentence, I felt a deep calm settling over me, the kind of peace that comes not from revenge, but from witnessing justice finally served. After the trial, I stood outside the courthouse with Maya and Detective Morrison, watching the late afternoon sun paint the city in shades of gold and orange. Reporters asked questions about how it felt to see my uncle sent to prison, whether I thought the sentence was fair, what message I hoped the verdict would send to other families dealing with drunk driving. I answered their questions politely but briefly, explaining that the trial had never been about punishment for its own sake, but about accountability and public safety. Uncle Marcus's pattern of drunk driving had been enabled by family members who chose protection over justice, and that enabling had allowed his dangerous behavior to continue until it was nearly inevitable that someone would be seriously hurt. "Do you feel closure now?" one reporter asked, and I considered the question carefully before responding. "I feel like justice," I said finally, "but closure isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, and I've been choosing it for years now by building a life that's meaningful and authentic instead of waiting for other people to give me permission to heal." The months following Uncle Marcus's conviction brought changes I hadn't anticipated. My parents reached out more frequently, tentative attempts at rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured but not completely destroyed. My mother called every few weeks, awkward conversations about my work and the weather that gradually became more natural as we learned to navigate this new version of our connection. My father's apology the night before the trial had opened a door that I hadn't realized I wanted to walk through. We began having lunch occasionally, careful meetings at restaurants where we could practice being family again without the pressure of home and history and all the ways we'd failed each other. During one of these lunches, he told me that Uncle Marcus had written me a letter from prison. He'd asked my father to deliver it, but my father wanted to check with me first before passing along anything that might disrupt the peace I'd worked so hard to build. "What does it say?" I asked, cutting my sandwich into smaller pieces while I considered whether I wanted to read words that Uncle Marcus had written from his prison cell. "I haven't read it," my father said quickly. "He sealed it and asked me to give it to you if you were willing to receive it. But Elena, you don't owe him anything. You don't have to read his letter or respond to it or consider his feelings at all. You've done enough." I thought about Uncle Marcus sitting in prison, probably scared and lonely, finally facing the consequences of choices he'd made repeatedly over years. I thought about the young man I'd known growing up, who taught me card games and bought me birthday presents and made me feel special in the way that uncles can. I thought about the drunk driver who destroyed my legs and then let my family cover up his crime to protect his own freedom. "I'll read it," I said finally, "but not because I owe him anything.
because I want to know what he has to say now that he's finally being held accountable for his actions. The letter was 3 pages long, written in the careful handwriting of someone with too much time and too much regret. Uncle Marcus wrote about prison, about sobriety, about the alcohol treatment programs he was participating in, and the ways he was finally confronting the addiction that had shaped so many of his choices. He wrote about our family, about the guilt he carried for allowing them to protect him, about the shame of knowing that his actions had torn us all apart. But mostly, he wrote about me, about watching me grow up, about being proud of the woman I'd become, about the devastating realization that he'd been the one to steal my mobility and independence through his own selfish choices. He wrote about following my work with disability advocacy from prison, reading articles about my speaking engagements and the nonprofit where I worked, feeling proud and heartbroken in equal measure. The letter ended with something I hadn't expected. Not a request for forgiveness or reconciliation, but a thank you.
He thanked me for refusing to let our family's cover-up succeed, for insisting on accountability, even when it cost me relationships I'd valued. He thanked me for probably saving lives by creating a legal record of his drunk driving that had finally led to real consequences. I know now that if you hadn't sued me, if you'd accepted the family's private handling of the situation, I would have kept drinking and driving until I killed someone, he wrote. Your courage in seeking justice, even when it meant losing your family, probably prevented me from becoming a murderer. I will never be able to repay that debt, but I want you to know that I understand what you did for all the potential victims I might have hurt if you'd stayed silent. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents. I didn't plan to respond, but I also didn't plan to throw it away. It felt like evidence, not just of his remorse, but of the complex mathematics of justice and accountability, and the ways that holding people responsible for their actions can interrupt cycles of harm that might otherwise continue indefinitely. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an invitation that surprised me. A national organization that advocated for victims of drunk driving wanted me to speak at their annual conference, to share my story with other families who were navigating the intersection of love and justice and accountability. I'd done local speaking before, small events at community centers and support groups, but this felt bigger and more significant. The conference would draw hundreds of people from across the country, families who'd lost loved ones to drunk drivers, survivors of drunk driving crashes, advocates working to change laws and social attitudes about impaired driving. Maya helped me prepare for the speech, and as we sat in my apartment working on my notes, she asked a question that had been lurking in the back of my mind for weeks. How do you want to end this story, Elena? Not just the speech, but everything. The lawsuit, the trial, the family stuff, all of it. How do you want this chapter of your life to conclude? I thought about her question as I watched the sun set behind the city skyline, painting my apartment in shades of gold and pink that made everything look softer and more hopeful than usual. How did I want this story to end? Not with reconciliation that pretended the past hadn't happened, and not with bitterness that poisoned my future. Something else entirely. I want it to end with hope, I said finally. Not the naive kind of hope that pretends bad things don't happen or that families always do the right thing, but the harder kind of hope that says we can survive betrayal and trauma and still choose to build something beautiful with our lives. The speech went well. I stood at the podium in my wheelchair, looking out at an audience filled with people who understood loss and grief and the complicated process of healing from harm caused by people we love. I told them about my accident, about my family's cover-up, about my decision to seek justice even when it cost me relationships I'd treasured. But I also told them about the life I'd built in the aftermath, about the work I did helping other people navigate similar challenges, about the friends who'd become family when my biological family failed me, about the peace I'd found in choosing authenticity over comfort. Family loyalty is important, I said near the end of my speech, but it's not more important than accountability. Love is crucial, but it's not more crucial than justice. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal comes at enormous personal cost. After the conference, I received hundreds of emails from people who'd heard my speech or read articles about my case.
Some thanked me for giving them courage to speak up about their own family situations. Others shared stories about their own struggles with addiction and enabling, and the difficult process of choosing accountability over comfort. But one email stood out from all the others. It was from a woman named Patricia Chen, whose teenage daughter had been killed by a drunk driver 2 years earlier. The driver was Patricia's own brother, and their family had pressured her not to cooperate with criminal prosecution because it would destroy him. I read your story and realized I was failing my daughter by protecting the person who killed her, Patricia wrote. I called the prosecutor yesterday and told them I'm ready to testify. It's not too late to seek justice, and I have you to thank for showing me that family loyalty and accountability can coexist. I printed that email and added it to the collection of letters I kept in my desk drawer, reminders that courage can be contagious, and that choosing the difficult path sometimes creates room for other people to make difficult choices too. The years that followed brought continued healing and growth. My relationship with my parents slowly improved, built on a foundation of honesty about what had happened and realistic expectations about what was possible moving forward. We would never be the close-knit family we'd been before the accident, but we learned to love each other within the boundaries created by our shared history. I published a book about my experience, a memoir that became a resource for other families dealing with the intersection of addiction, enabling, and justice. The book tour took me across the country, speaking to audiences about the courage required to hold loved ones accountable and the peace that comes from choosing authenticity over harmony. Maya and I remained close, our friendship deepened by the trials we'd weathered together. She eventually married Carmen, the social worker she'd been dating, and I served as maid of honor at their wedding, grateful for people who'd chosen to love me not despite my difficult choices, but because of them. Uncle Marcus was released from prison after serving 3.5 years. He moved to another state upon his release, starting fresh in a place where his history wasn't known, where he could build a sober life without the weight of our family's complicated dynamics. We didn't maintain contact, but I heard through relatives that he'd remained sober, found work in construction, and occasionally volunteered with organizations that helped other recovering alcoholics navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives. I was glad he was sober and building something better, but his redemption wasn't something I needed to witness or validate. He'd harmed me, and I'd held him accountable, and now we were both free to move forward with our separate lives. Sometimes that's what healing looks like, not reconciliation or forgiveness, but parallel paths towards something better than what came before. 5 years after the criminal trial, I received a letter that brought my story full circle. It was from Jennifer Walsh, the woman who'd first written to me about her brother's drunk driving. She was writing to tell me that her brother had been sober for 3 years, that he'd started speaking at high schools about the dangers of drunk driving, that he'd never forgotten the impact of seeing her hold him accountable for his actions. Your courage to seek justice gave me courage to seek justice, she wrote, and my courage to hold my brother accountable helped him find his own courage to get sober and make amends. The ripples of choosing accountability over comfort extend further than we can imagine. I folded her letter and placed it with the others, a collection of stories about the courage to choose justice over convenience, truth over harmony, authentic love over comfortable enabling. They were reminders that my accident and everything that followed hadn't been meaningless suffering, but part of a larger story about the ways that individual choices can create space for other people to make different choices too. That evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the city in familiar shades of gold and orange, thinking about the person I'd been before my accident and the person I'd become in its aftermath. The young woman lying on that yellow blanket in my grandmother's driveway had been someone who let other people make decisions about her life, who prioritized other people's comfort over her own well-being, who confused keeping peace with keeping love. The woman I'd become was someone who chose difficult conversations over comfortable silence, who understood that accountability and love could coexist, who'd learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to let someone you care about avoid the consequences of their actions. My legs would never work again, and my family would never be the same, and Uncle Marcus would always be the person who destroyed my mobility through his selfish choices. But I'd also discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, built relationships based on authenticity rather than obligation, and found purpose in helping other people navigate similar challenges. The accident had stolen my legs, but everything that followed had given me something more valuable:
The knowledge that I could survive betrayal and trauma and still choose to build something beautiful with my life. The understanding that justice and love weren't opposites, but partners in the complex work of creating a world where people are held accountable for the harm they cause, even when those people are family. As the sun disappeared behind the city skyline, I thought about all the people who'd written to me over the years, all the families who'd found courage to choose accountability over comfort, all the potential victims who'd been protected by someone's decision to refuse to enable dangerous behavior. My story had begun with a question about what to do when the people who are supposed to protect you choose to protect someone else instead. The answer I'd discovered, through years of difficult choices and painful growth, was simple but not easy. You learn to protect yourself, and in doing so, you become the person you always had the potential to be. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in months, recording thoughts about justice and healing and the unexpected ways that courage can multiply when someone chooses truth over convenience. The entry ended with a sentence that felt like both conclusion and beginning. Some losses teach you who you really are, and some victories teach you who you have the strength to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.